Hello, arboriculture students. Today we're going to talk about urban tree inventories. And so I first want to talk about why we might conduct an urban tree inventory. And on the screen is a shot of a sample inventory that has GPS locations for each of the trees. And there are many reasons why we might conduct an inventory. And so just think about for a minute, when we talk about urban forests compared to yard trees or individually owned trees, the urban forest we're trying to manage as a whole. And so there's lots of different things that we might need to consider when we're managing the whole forest. Some of these things include the composition of the forest. So what are the trees that we have? What different species? How old are the trees? Do we have planting spots that we need to put something in? And then the location. Ideally, we'd have some kind of location associated with each of the trees, whether it's a GPS point or a physical address of the home that it's next to, so that we can identify where we have to go when we need to do some work on those trees. We might also identify the characteristics of their trees. So not just the species, and I think I already said how old they are, but how old they are or how big they are. What stage of life are they in? Are they newly planted, mature trees, over mature trees that might need to be replaced soon? Do they have some kind of condition that we need to be aware of? And whether this is as it relates to maintenance or risk or some other thing, some other attribute that is important to know about. And so what are the details about each of our trees? Once we have all of those things, we can calculate the benefits of the trees. And so in this little graphic on the other side of the screen, just goes over some sample benefits that trees have. This is for Pittsburgh. And so we talked earlier in the semester about the benefits of trees. And so if we want to actually determine what those benefits are, we need to know what we have. And there are different levels of inventories. When we're looking at community-based inventories, we're typically talking about inventorying the trees that are the responsibility of the municipality. And so all of the city-owned trees, for example. And so typically these are trees that grow in the tree lawn or tree boulevard, which is between the between the curb and the sidewalk, that planting strip. There's lots of little names for that strip of lawn. I will refer to it most of the time as a tree lawn. Municipal trees might also include those in parks or around buildings that are municipal buildings. There could be other right-of-ways that the city or village manages, and there's trees within those as well. Counties sometimes have highway right-of-ways where they manage the trees along the highways. And so that's going to vary depending on the level of jurisdiction that you're looking at. So we might be looking at doing a citywide inventory of all of the city's own trees. We could be looking at just doing a neighborhood or a ward or district or some community within the community, a development, for example. We could also be looking at trying to do an inventory of all the trees privately and publicly owned in a community. There are some communities that have done this, though it's not that common. Access is rather tricky. We can do those kind of inventories on a broad-based level where you're using aerial photographs or satellite images to get an understanding of cover and maybe species, but not that detailed. Typically, the level of inventory is going to depend on the goals that we have for the inventory and the amount of funds that we have to cover that inventory. And so the goals are really also the uses for the inventory. And so oftentimes when we look at the uses of an inventory, we're looking at identifying work order situations, which trees need to be pruned, which trees need to be removed, are there pest issues that we have to deal with, and we might also be looking for planting locations. In some cases, we use this information to develop a management plan. We're gathering information about our forest that can feed into a long-term plan. And typically management plans are going to be 5 to 10 years, and inventories might be conducted as well on a rotation where we're not inventorying the whole city every single year, but maybe on a 7 to 10 year rotation. And so we do need to identify what our goals and objectives are, as well as the needs and priorities for our inventory. Some of these goals and objectives might include identifying trees with risk when we're concerned about liability, or along those same lines, trees that have potential for significant insect, for example, emerald ash borer, significant insect effects that we might need to be proactive about removing or replacing or treating in some fashion, so to limit the liability that we have going down the road. So typically, we are going to have some level of understanding of risk, whether it's this tree is showing something that somebody with an expertise needs to come back and look at, or having a very thorough evaluation done on every tree. Typically, we're going to also look at the characteristics of those individual trees, the species, the size, the age, though age is really hard to tell. If we have the planting records, we can figure out how old it is, but size and age do not relate to each other. Condition and health is the other characteristic that we often look at. And then whether or not there needs to be any kind of maintenance conducted on that tree, whether it needs to be pruned or removed, and to what level the pruning needs to happen. We can also determine whether or not we can use, or we should determine whether or not we're going to be using this inventory to feed into work plans and then maybe management plans. Is the inventory conducted to then create next year's work plans for pruning and planting in that neighborhood? And we often need to think about what trees are we going to preserve? Do we have ordinances or goals for preserving old trees? Training or improving tree structure? And then what is our maintenance priority? How do we decide which trees get maintenance over other trees? If we have an inventory that we conduct every few years, we typically can track the history of that tree. And if we have a robust database, we can keep all of the inventory data along with the work history of each tree in that database. And so I can look back at a tree that might be having a problem and see what we've noticed over the years and what work has been done prior. And oftentimes we can link those databases with other related work things, like whether there was sidewalks that had to be replaced in that neighborhood, or utility work, and kind of correlate what's happened to that tree over the years. We can also develop a cost-benefit analysis for individual trees. If I know I have a tree that I'm continually going out to maintain, I can decide whether or not it's worth keeping that tree in the landscape. And I can look at the individual performance of each tree. And so when I'm looking at developing my inventory, I might want to know how often I'm going to be conducting that inventory and what other data that inventory can be linked to. And is that inventory just going to be a one-time inventory where I just need to go out and get some kind of understanding of what I have? Or is it periodic? Do I have it on a regular schedule where I know that data will be updated? And I also need to identify what the usefulness of that inventory is. Typically speaking, an inventory is really only good for a few years. As trees within that inventory fail or are pruned, removed, trees are coming out of that inventory and trees are going in, and so it does have to be updated to be useful long term. So if I conducted an inventory in 2010 and now it's 2020, my data is 10 years old on that inventory. Is that a good enough window? Some of the benefits of using an inventory versus just, for example, having people call in when they see problems or situations with trees that need to be addressed. If I have an inventory, I can cluster the work. And so I know that these trees in a certain neighborhood are all going to need structural pruning, versus another batch of trees in that neighborhood are going to need more extensive work. Maybe I need to bring in a boom lift or some other different set of tools to manage one set of trees versus another. So I can schedule work appropriately and organize crews. I can also have improved community relationships. If I know that there's a tree that's causing problems, or if I've been to visit a particular tree and I get a call from a homeowner, I can look up quickly that information about that tree and be able to have a conversation with the homeowner about that tree and what our plans are for that tree. Some communities have access to their tree data online, and so homeowners can go in and kind of see where their tree is at and maybe learn a little bit about their tree. And we'll be looking at something like that in one of Vermont's portals. And I can also do some emergency preparedness. Having an understanding of where maybe large trees are or trees that are vulnerable to a particular pest outbreak can be important. And I've already mentioned the emerald ash borer. Many communities have been identifying all of their ash trees, and so they know when emerald ash borer is near them that they need to start either treating them or removing them, to be proactive about that. With large trees or trees of a particular species, maybe something that we know breaks apart a lot, like silver maple, if I'm experiencing, or if the community experiences heavy winds for some reason, I might need to go out and check those particular trees because I know they might be more likely to drop limbs. There are other benefits of using an inventory, and one of them is to justify the budget for the trees. So being able to calculate the benefits of those trees, the tangible and the intangible benefits, can help justify all the time and money that goes into maintaining them and planting them. Having a good understanding of the condition of those trees, again, you can justify your budget if you know that you've got a lot of older trees that are going to need more maintenance, or you're looking at training a whole bunch of trees. You can build that into the budget, and it's more justifiable when it comes time to pass that budget. As well as planting. If you've identified areas that have a lot of needs for planting, you can put that in the budget. The inventory also helps us document actions, and we've talked about this a little bit when it comes to liability and risk. And so if we know we have a tree that we've been working on or that's been identified as having a problem, and we have it scheduled and something happens before we're able to do that work, we have some kind of proof of our understanding of what's going on with that tree and our intent to manage it. And so it can show that we are maintaining things properly and that we're doing our due diligence trying to maintain our urban forest. It can also help with contractor relations. If I'm a community that has to contract out pruning, we don't have our own tree crew, for example, I have an inventory. I know I can send the contractor very specific information about what trees that they need to work in, and I can follow up with them on those trees, and it can help reduce confusion. So when we're conducting an inventory, we have to think about what level of inventory we want to conduct. We talked about whether it's a neighborhood or the whole community. And then what type of ability do I have in the office to view that inventory and manage that inventory, as well as who is actually going to be completing the inventory. And so if I want to have a really accurate inventory, very good tree identification and measurements, I might need to hire professionals to come in and conduct that inventory. Many communities don't have the funds to use professionals, and so they might use volunteers. Volunteers are good from a cost-saving perspective, but often lack the skills, especially with identification. Tree measuring skills are a little easier to teach than identification, and many communities have dozens, if not over 100 different tree species. And so volunteers can have good accuracy or poor accuracy, depending on the level of work that they do. Full-time staff working for that community that's trained in urban forestry, or contractors who are trained in urban forestry, their accuracy is much higher. And so depending on what I'm going to use my inventory for and how much money I have to spend on it, I might choose one set of inventory personnel over another. I'm also going to decide what type of data collection equipment I want to use. Most of the time, especially these days, we want to collect that data electronically using a PDA or a tablet of some sort. Oftentimes when you're working with volunteers, depending on what kind of technology they have access to, you might still have to go with paper, and then that paper has to be transcribed into the computer. It's also helpful these days to use GPS, and most people have access to a GPS unit, whether it's a volunteer and or a contractor. Volunteer GPS units typically not going to be quite as accurate, but sometimes it gets you close enough. If you're within 50 feet of the right tree, you can probably figure out which one you need to be at, especially if it's associated with a house address. And so again, a lot of this stuff is going to depend on the budget. for data collection, but then also what kind of software are you going to use. There is a free inventory software that's put together by the government and a bunch of private business cooperatives, or collaboration, I should say, and that's the iTree tools, and we'll talk about that, and that's what your homework assignment is going to be. Your lab assignment for this week is going to be using the iTree suite to collect some data. And so that's free, and it's a relatively robust system, but there is a lot of private inventory systems that you can add pictures to and put in work histories and maintenance histories, inventory histories, that can be even better. And so depending on what my budget is for my community, I might have privately run software or software that's created by that community, or I might use free software like iTree. So I need to identify what kind of software I want to use, and then I also need to know who's going to maintain it. And so even after I collect all this data and I have the software, who in the community is going to be in charge of managing that data? Do I have somebody with the technical knowledge to do that? Or is it really just going to be somewhat of a static inventory that we look at, we're using for broad-based management decisions, but I'm not necessarily using it to identify work order priorities? Another thing to consider is the type of inventory. Often when we talk about street tree inventories, we're conducting what we'd call a complete inventory. And this is where we'd have every tree on every street in the city inventoried. And that doesn't necessarily have to happen all in the same year, but it would happen in a cycle. We can also do partial inventories, where we might focus on one particular neighborhood or one particular species, and we might do something called a windshield inventory, where, especially if we're looking for a particular group of species, just drive around and see how many of those ash trees are there and make note of them, versus a complete inventory. We could also do samples. Sample inventories are really helpful when we're trying to do things like determine the number of trees that we have in a community or the diversity of tree species, or when we don't necessarily have the budget to go out and do a complete inventory. We do a sample inventory to get some basic understandings of the characteristics of our forest for broad management planning. Specifically, I also need to determine what data I want to collect. And so I'm going to go through some of the fields that we might be collecting with our iTree sample, but these are very typical ones that you would collect. And so the first thing is location. If we have a GPS, that's great. We can get the latitude and longitude. We also want to associate that typically with an address. And so GPS is relatively accurate depending on the type of GPS unit that you're using, but it's also helpful to actually have the street address of the house or building that the tree is in front of. Usually once we've documented that address, we have some systematic numbering that we use on a property. And so we might go east to west or north to south and number the trees along the front of the house, for example. So if the house has 3 trees in front of it, say it's 24 Elm Street, tree number 1, tree number 2, and tree number 3, going from east to west. And then that would be systematic throughout the whole community. We also want to identify the type of site that tree is growing in. Is it a tree lawn in between the curb and the sidewalk? Is it a tree pit? And those are the kinds of things that you see in downtown areas where there's a cutout in the sidewalk or in a paved area and there's a cell that the tree is growing in. And the trees that are between the library and Stuac on the quad there, those are growing in tree pits. Is it a park tree that has a lot of grass? Is it growing in a median in the highway? So where is that tree? What kind of hardscapes are surrounding that tree? Sometimes we might document the size of the site. If it's a tree lawn, how wide is that tree lawn? How long is it? That can give us an understanding of how much rooting volume the tree potentially has. And then also whether there are overhead utilities, specifically 3-phase wires. And 3-phase wires are the utility electric wires that have 3 of them together on the poles. There's 3-phase and single phase, and every so often you'll find 2-phase where there's just 2 wires. typically speaking, utility companies are most interested in pruning those that are three-phase wires and less interested with the single phase. And so it's useful to know what the overhead utilities are, to know where utility companies might be coming in to prune, and then also when thinking about planting sites, whether you should be planting a small tree or you can get away with a large tree if there are no overhead utilities. We're typically also going to collect information about what type of tree it is, what the species is. And then typically we're also going to collect the diameter. And this is really the only time we might need some kind of extra tool besides a tablet or some other place to record our data. So we might use a diameter tape or calipers. Every so often you might use a Biltmore stick. Typically people use diameter tapes, which is a measuring tape that wraps around the tree. I do not know if you've all used one, but it's they're easy to use. You're actually measuring circumference, but collecting diameter. The tape is calibrated to measure diameter using the circumference. And so that's usually the only specialized tool that you need with any of this. We're also going to want to collect the condition rating for the tree. And this is where some training usually has to happen. What is the definition of good versus fair versus poor? Dead is usually pretty straightforward. And so what are these benchmarks? And then we also need to decide what that means. If someone marks a tree as poor, is that tree going to be re-inspected by a certified arborist or someone from the community that has expertise to decide what's going to happen with that tree? We also look at the condition of the wood, the trunk of the tree, as well as the condition of the canopy and the foliage. Because we can have decay in the wood and the canopy can look fine, or the canopy can be suffering. There might be decline or chlorosis in the canopy, but the trunk looks fine. And so we will typically separate those two categories out. Another attribute that we might want to have for each tree is what kind of maintenance is recommended. Typically, if volunteers are conducting the inventory, we may not have volunteers collect this kind of data. They generally don't have enough training to make these determinations. But so these are some of the common pruning objectives that we might have for trees. And so, does it need to be removed? Is the tree dead, for example? Generally, then we might have to remove it. Does it need to be pruned? And some of these might have extra details where we identify the level of pruning, the size of the branches, or we might just say what kind of pruning by category. Is there a clearance issue? Do we have to raise it up off the sidewalk or clear it away from a stop sign? Does it need some structural pruning and training? Do we need to reduce it from overhead obstructions? Or is there a stump there that needs to be ground? And in many cases, if there's something that we're not sure what's going on, we might have someone come and re-inspect. And this is again where we might have a certified arborist come out or whoever's in charge of the trees at the city. And they would come out and decide what's happening. Depending on the objectives of our inventory, we might collect some additional information. The iTree tools system has the ability to process the benefits of our trees, both individually and community-wide. And depending on the level of accuracy we want for those benefits, we'd have to include things like the height of the tree and the crown spread. The system that we use, which is iTree Streets, we don't have to put those two pieces of information in. It uses the information based on the species and the diameter of the trunk to estimate the potential height and crown spread of those trees. And so we get kind of a ballpark figure. But if we want really detailed information, using an additional model, we would be collecting tree height and crown spread. So if we do that, we would probably also need to have a tape measure and maybe a clinometer or some other tool to measure height of the trees. And so we might need additional tools if we want to collect those pieces of information. We might be also collecting information about pests, and we can set up the data collectors with drop-down menus for common pests or train volunteers to identify certain things or categories. And so whether there's cankers or foliar problems, we might just have things listed by category. We could list other details about the tree, whether it's cabled, has lightning protection, or some other interesting bit of information that's useful to have in the inventory. We could do risk assessments, and this is where I'll say we've talked about certified arborists, and there's also the track qualifications that the International Society of Arboriculture has, and they have one for tree risk assessment qualification, and many communities now are hiring contractors to perform at least level 1 risk assessments on all of their trees, which is kind of a big undertaking. And so that form that you filled out for lab, for the risk assessment, essentially conducting that level of inventory, that level of analysis on every tree in a community. You have to have that certification, that qualification to do that. And so that is an area that we're seeing a lot of growth in, and I get multiple calls a year from communities asking for that level of service, which is amazing to me. So we might have an interest in risk assessments on a lot of trees, or sometimes just some trees, especially if there's a special project going on in an area. We might also be concerned with plant healthcare situations, whether it's pest identification or things that we can do to improve the health of the tree. And so whether or not a tree has supplemental irrigation, whether it's been mulched, whether trees have been fertilized. Sometimes it's hard to tell when you're doing an inventory whether something's been fertilized, but you can definitely tell whether there's mulch or not. And oftentimes we're going to take photographs of each of the trees. And the iStreets system does not have the ability to gather images, but most of the commercially available inventory products do. And you would take a picture of that tree and store it with all this other information. So I've already mentioned iTree, which we'll look at in just a moment, and then I just have a screenshot of a private inventory software system. So this is an example of a commercially available tree care or tree inventory system, and they've gotten even more sophisticated than this one now. But this is just an example, and so you can see here in the middle, so here's the caller. So Ken, here's his address, and so I can call and I can look up right in the system to see what trees Ken might have at his house. And so this guy's interested in having his tree planted and wants to know when it's going to be. So I can look up and kind of see what data we've collected about that, the type of work. So here's the work history. And then here are all the trees nearby, or the addresses of the houses nearby. So I'm clicking on his, and here's the tree attribute, or in this case, it's a planting site attribute. And so I might be able to have planting sites, removals, stump grinding, trees. And so here's the different observations here, some of the things that might be problems with that site. And so I have everything kind of at my fingertips, and I can work my way through any questions that are brought up by different people. So after this, you'll find a separate video going through the iTree Streets software package. So please watch that.